The autumn of 1944 marked the final desperate threshold for the Japanese Empire in the Pacific War. With the capture of the Marianas and the relentless advance of Allied forces, the American war machine stood poised to strike at the Philippines, a geographical and spiritual heartland of the Japanese defense perimeter. The strategic significance of the Philippines was absolute. Its loss would not only sever the vital sea lanes connecting Japan to its oil-rich conquests in the Dutch East Indies, but would also place Allied forces directly on the doorstep of the Japanese home islands. For the Imperial High Command, the defense of the Philippines was an existential imperative, demanding the commitment of virtually every remaining naval, air, and land resource. The American objective was Leyte Gulf, a vast, sheltered body of water targeted for the largest amphibious landing yet attempted in the Pacific. The invasion force, led by General Douglas MacArthur, was overwhelming, backed by the immense power of the U.S. 3rd and 7th Fleets. The Japanese response was codified in the desperate, audacious Operation Shogo 1, Victory Operation, a complex, all-or-nothing naval maneuver designed to lure away the main American carrier fleet and annihilate the vulnerable invasion force in a decisive final battle. This maneuver, however, depended entirely on the Japanese ability to achieve localized air superiority and penetrate the dense, multi-layered air and naval defenses protecting the massive American fleet. The Japanese commitment to air defense was a high-risk gamble built on desperation. Their naval air arm, decimated by the losses at Midway and the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot, was functionally incapable of challenging the overwhelming number of American carrier aircraft. Yet the Japanese command ordered every available aircraft, pilots, planes, and support units from the Philippines and surrounding islands to be concentrated in a massive final effort to disrupt the American advance. This was a final, futile deployment of air power, a strategic act of desperation that ignored the overwhelming material and technological disparity. The ultimate confrontation was not merely a clash of ships or pilots. It was a collision between Japanese suicidal will and overwhelming American technology. The Japanese pilots, often flying obsolete or hastily repaired aircraft, were motivated by a rigid code of honor and the knowledge that this was their final mission. The American defense, conversely, was a sophisticated integrated system of radar, anti-aircraft artillery, and highly trained pilots, a technological fortress designed to absorb massive attacks and inflict devastating, disproportionate losses. The stage was set for the immense, chaotic Battle of Leyte Gulf, a series of complex naval and aerial engagements that would deliver the final, irrevocable verdict on the Japanese capacity to wage modern, industrial warfare. The Japanese pilots flew into the Philippines expecting a fierce fight. Instead, they met a technologically impenetrable wall they never imagined. The desperate aerial assaults launched by the Japanese against the massive American fleet in Leyte Gulf were met not by individual fighter opposition, but by a technologically integrated wall of flak and radar, a lethal systematic defense that exposed the fatal obsolescence of the Japanese air war doctrine. This defense transformed the skies over the Philippines into a zone of annihilation, demonstrating the total supremacy of the American anti-aircraft and air defense system. The most shocking element of the Japanese assault was the organized introduction of the kamikaze, the divine wind, suicide attack units. These were pilots who deliberately flew their aircraft, loaded with explosives, directly into the massive hulls of American carriers and battleships. This tactic, born of tactical desperation and a profound lack of conventional air power, represented a catastrophic ethical and strategic failure, prioritizing the destruction of enemy materiel over the life of the pilot and the preservation of irreplaceable flight training resources. The kamikaze attacks inflicted immense psychological shock and localized severe damage on the American fleet, but they were met with an immediate, systematic technological response. The core of the American defense was radar superiority. Ships were equipped with sophisticated long-range radar systems that could detect the incoming Japanese formations, conventional and kamikaze alike, at immense distances, providing critical time for the fleet to launch its own fighters and prepare the concentrated anti-aircraft defense. This technological foresight neutralized the element of surprise, the kamikaze's only true advantage, allowing the American defense to engage the attackers on favorable terms. The technological superiority was amplified by the sheer volume of anti-aircraft firepower. Every ship in the massive American fleet, from the smallest destroyer to the largest fleet carrier, was bristling with automated high-rate-of-fire anti-aircraft guns, including the ubiquitous 40mm Bofors and 20mm Oerlikon cannons. This concentrated defensive firepower created a lethal, continuous cloud of exploding shrapnel and tracer fire, a genuine wall of flak that disintegrated the incoming Japanese aircraft before they could reach their targets. The Japanese pilots, flying through this barrage, found themselves facing a technologically overwhelming opponent that was systematically designed to guarantee their annihilation. The immense losses of aircraft and pilots suffered by the Japanese in the Leyte aerial assaults were catastrophic and functionally irreplaceable. The Japanese capacity to wage an organized, sustained air war was definitively broken over the Philippines, confirming the total strategic failure of Operation Shogo. The Japanese pilots flew into the American fleet expecting a fierce fight. Instead, they were consumed by a technologically superior integrated defensive system that they could neither evade nor overcome. Attention, Air Defense Command. You've witnessed the terrifying birth of the kamikaze and the technological brilliance of the American response. The wall of flak held firm. If the sheer scale of the anti-aircraft defense and the strategic role of radar resonate with your understanding of modern naval warfare, then do not let the defense soften. Subscribe now and commit to analyzing the battles where technology dictated air superiority. And here is your tactical query. Was the anti-aircraft success near Leyte more reliant on the early detection provided by radar or the sheer volume of firepower from the Bofors and Oerlikon guns? Drop your strategic assessment in the comments below. Let the historical debate define the defense perimeter. The crushing Japanese defeat in the air battles over Leyte was a brutal confirmation of the obsolescence of their air doctrine and the fundamental failure to prioritize material quantity and technological resilience over rigid, traditional tactical quality. The Japanese pilots were tactically brilliant, but their aircraft and their operational planning were fatally flawed against the overwhelming industrialized reality of the American war machine. The Japanese air doctrine, rooted in the early war success of highly maneuverable but lightly armored aircraft like the Zero, emphasized pilot skill and rapid maneuver over durability and self-protection. This doctrine was catastrophic when faced with the heavily armored, high-performance American aircraft and the devastating concentration of anti-aircraft fire. Japanese planes were easily damaged, difficult to repair, and suffered catastrophic losses when confronted with the immense rate of fire from the American Bofors and Oerlikon cannons. The structural vulnerability of the Japanese aircraft amplified the effect of the superior American defense. The fatal strategic failure was the Japanese commitment to localized, high-cost quality production over mass quantity. While the Japanese continued to produce highly sophisticated but complex aircraft, their production capacity was dwarfed by the massive assembly line output of the American industrial base. The loss of a single, highly trained Japanese pilot and his specialized aircraft was functionally irreplaceable. The loss of an American fighter or bomber was immediately compensated by the continuous influx of materiel from the massive industrial network. The sheer, overwhelming volume of American aircraft and supplies guaranteed the total consumption of the Japanese air arm. The Japanese pilots' adherence to the kamikaze doctrine was the final, desperate testament to this technological and material obsolescence. The Imperial Command recognized that their conventional air power could not penetrate the sophisticated American defenses. The suicide attacks were a catastrophic strategic gamble that prioritized the destruction of enemy materiel over the preservation of irreplaceable flight training resources. This moral and operational collapse confirmed the ultimate strategic reality. The Japanese air war was lost because their industrial and logistical base could not sustain the immense demands of modern, high-intensity aerial combat. The strategic verdict of the Leyte air battles was unassailable. Material superiority and technological resilience triumph over localized tactical quality. The sophisticated, integrated American air defense system, fueled by overwhelming industrial output, systematically defeated the Japanese air arm, accelerating the total collapse of the Japanese capacity to wage modern, sustained warfare. The skies over the Philippines became the final decisive proof that the Japanese air doctrine was fatally obsolete against the industrialized power of the American system. The ultimate strategic goal of the immense air and naval engagement at Leyte Gulf was the non-negotiable securing of the final supply route, the vast, vital sea lanes leading directly into the Philippines. The success of the American defense was the essential precondition for the long-term, sustained operation that would be necessary to conquer the archipelago and prepare the final assault on Japan. The strategic logic was clear: control the sea lanes, control the fate of the Pacific War. The Philippines served as the critical logistical and geographical choke point between Japan and its vital oil and resource conquests in the south. The capture of the archipelago would sever the logistical lifeline that sustained the Japanese industry, compounding the effects of the strategic bombing campaign and accelerating the total economic strangulation of the Japanese Empire. The successful defense of Leyte Gulf guaranteed that the American supply fleet could operate with near impunity, pouring the massive material resources necessary to sustain the long ground campaign onto the islands. The Japanese strategic commitment to Operation Shogo was a desperate, high-risk effort to prevent this logistical catastrophe. Their entire naval maneuver was designed to disrupt the American supply lines and isolate the invasion force, forcing a costly retreat. The failure of this strategic maneuver, sealed by the devastation of their naval air arm, confirmed the total loss of the sea lanes and the subsequent collapse of their industrial lifeline. The remaining Japanese forces were permanently relegated to isolated garrisons, cut off from any realistic hope of reinforcement or resupply. The immense American logistical buildup in the Philippines, fueled by the secure sea lanes, was a final, stunning demonstration of the organizational and industrial supremacy that defined the Pacific War. The rapid establishment of advanced logistical hubs, large-scale air bases, and supply depots was the necessary foundation for the continuous ground campaign and the final systematic strangulation of the Japanese military effort. The security of the supply route was the engine that guaranteed the relentless, unyielding momentum of the American advance. The strategic verdict of Leyte was unassailable. The battle was won by the army that controlled the sea lanes. The technological superiority of the American defense, fueled by immense industrial output, guaranteed the total security of the final supply route, ensuring that the Japanese Empire was systematically sealed off from its vital resources. The total collapse of the Japanese capacity to wage modern warfare was the direct consequence of the overwhelming logistical success achieved by the American forces over the Philippines. Attention, General Staff. You've witnessed the strategic genius of securing the final supply route, the ultimate key to conquering the Pacific. If the strategic logic of logistics and sea lane control resonates with your mind, do not let this critical lesson be lost. Subscribe now and commit to preserving the analysis of these vital strategic pivots. And here is your operational query. Did the failure of Operation Shogo stem more from the loss of the carrier air wing or the inability of the Japanese fleet to coordinate its movements under American air cover? Drop your strategic assessment in the comments below. Let the historical debate define naval strategy. The immense, chaotic battle of Leyte Gulf placed a massive commander's burden on the American leadership, forcing them to make high-stakes, moral, and strategic decisions under immense pressure. Decisions that, while securing the ultimate victory, exposed the profound human and operational cost of the conflict. The burden was borne primarily by the two fleet commanders, Admiral William Bull Halsey, commanding the Fast Carrier Task Force, the Third Fleet, and Admiral Thomas C. Kincaid, commanding the Seventh Fleet, protecting the invasion force. Halsey's primary burden was the strategic gamble of the decoy. The crucial Japanese plan depended on the success of a decoy carrier force led by Vice Admiral Jisaburo Ozawa, to lure Halsey's powerful Third Fleet away from the Leyte Gulf, leaving the invasion force exposed to the main Japanese surface fleet. Halsey, driven by an aggressive commitment to annihilate the remaining Japanese carrier force, took the bait, leading the Third Fleet north. This decision, while tactically successful in destroying the remaining Japanese carriers, exposed the Seventh Fleet and the vulnerable landing force to immense danger from the advancing main Japanese surface fleet. His high-stakes gamble was a defining, controversial moment of the entire battle. Kinkaid's burden was the immediate, desperate defense of the invasion force. Faced with the sudden, shocking realization that Halsey's powerful defense had been lured away, Kinkaid's Seventh Fleet, composed largely of slow, older battleships and escort carriers, was forced to defend the landing force against the immense advancing Japanese surface fleet. The ensuing battle off Samar, where American destroyers and escort carriers fought a suicidal, heroic defense against the Japanese battleships, was the climax of Kinkaid's command challenge. His desperate, courageous defense ultimately repelled the superior Japanese force, saving the invasion force, but exposing the immense risk of the overall strategic plan. The immense scale of the battle and the profound human cost placed a massive moral burden on the commanders. The decision to commit thousands of men and billions of dollars in materiel to the massive invasion was a high-stakes choice that exposed the American command to catastrophic risk. The individual heroism of the American sailors and pilots, fighting against overwhelming odds in a highly chaotic and fragmented environment, remains a testament to the morale and discipline of the American forces. The success of the command structure lay in its ability to manage the chaos, adapt to the immense strategic risk, and ultimately secure the final, non-negotiable strategic objective. The legacy of the late commanders is one of immense courage, strategic risk, and the profound moral burden of total war. Their decisions, made under immense pressure, secured the total victory. But the controversy surrounding the execution of Operation Shogo remains an enduring lesson in the immense strategic cost of high-stakes, final engagements. Final Command Report. You've tracked the massive burden on the American admirals, a study in high-stakes strategy and courage. If the complex choices made under fire resonate with your understanding of command, do not let the historical record be lost at sea. Subscribe now and commit to preserving the analysis of these pivotal command decisions. And here is your final intelligence task. Suggest the next great naval commander or pivotal fleet action of WE2, perhaps the battles of the Atlantic or the final Japanese fleet movements, or our deep dive analysis. Your suggestions guide our strategic mission. The chaotic near-disaster in Leyte Gulf was rescued by the heroic suicidal defense executed by the American escort carriers, CVEs, and destroyers during the battle off Samar. This engagement, a defining moment of individual courage and tactical desperation, was the crucial, localized action that ultimately guaranteed the success of the overall American strategy, highlighting the immense value of unexpected resistance against overwhelming power. The Japanese plan, following the successful decoy maneuver, called for the immensely powerful center force, led by battleships like the Yamato and Musashi, to sweep into Leyte Gulf and annihilate the vulnerable invasion fleet. Standing in their path was the small, seemingly insignificant Task Unit 77.4.3, codenamed Taffy 3, commanded by Rear Admiral Clifton Sprague. This unit was composed primarily of small, lightly armed escort carriers, known affectionately as jeep carriers, and a handful of destroyers and destroyer escorts, a force utterly outmatched by the oncoming Japanese battleships. The defense executed by Taffy 3 was characterized by audacious, high-risk tactics and unyielding courage. The American destroyers and escort carriers, utilizing smoke screens, continuous air attacks from their small planes, armed with minimal torpedoes and bombs, and aggressive close-quarters maneuvers, fought a suicidal delaying action. The American commanders committed their ships directly toward the massive Japanese surface fleet, drawing fire and confusing the Japanese command. This desperate, courageous maneuver, which cost the lives of many American sailors and the sinking of several ships, bought the necessary time for the main American forces to organize a cohesive response. The Japanese center force, believing they were engaging the main American fleet, due to the ferocity of the resistance, became disorganized and hesitated. Crucially, the Japanese commander, Admiral Takeo Kurita, inexplicably ordered a temporary withdrawal, believing the resistance was far greater than it actually was. This pause, directly caused by the audacious defense of Taffy 3, provided the ultimate strategic window for the American Third Fleet to race back south, guaranteeing the survival of the invasion fleet. The battle off Samar confirmed the immense, disproportionate impact of unexpected resistance in the face of strategic risk. The sacrifice of the escort carriers and destroyers, fighting against overwhelming odds, remains one of the most heroic and decisive naval actions of the Pacific War. Their courage, fueled by the knowledge of the immense strategic value of the invasion fleet they were protecting, was the essential human factor that guaranteed the total victory. The colossal, interconnected series of engagements that comprised the Battle of Leyte Gulf delivered the definitive final analysis on the state of the Japanese surface fleet, a total, irreversible strategic defeat that marked the end of the Japanese Navy as a cohesive fighting force. The immense losses of battleships, cruisers, and, crucially, carriers ensured that the sea lanes of the Pacific were permanently secured by the overwhelming power of the American fleet. The strategic loss of capital ships was catastrophic. The Japanese lost 4 carriers, including the decoy fleet, 3 battleships, including the massive Musashi, 6 heavy cruisers, and numerous light cruisers and destroyers. This immense destruction of naval assets, coupled with the previous losses at Midway and the Marianas, rendered the Japanese Navy functionally incapable of launching any further large-scale, coordinated fleet actions. The American strategy of annihilating the Japanese Navy in a decisive engagement, first conceived at Midway, was finally and totally realized at Leyte. The most critical loss was not merely the ships, but the accompanying loss of trained pilots and sailors. The Japanese capacity to replace the vast numbers of skilled personnel consumed by the kamikaze attacks and the conventional air battles was non-existent. The American forces, conversely, maintained a continuous flow of highly trained pilots and sailors, fueled by the massive American industrial and training base. The manpower disparity amplified the material losses, ensuring that the remaining Japanese fleet was manned by inexperienced, rapidly trained crews. The final analysis confirmed the total failure of Operation Shogo. The high-risk gamble, predicated on the desperate hope of annihilating the American invasion fleet, resulted only in the total consumption of Japan's remaining naval power. The immense strategic cost of the battle was total, guaranteeing the security of the American supply lines and the continuation of the relentless advance toward the Japanese home islands. The sea lanes of the Pacific were permanently secured by the American Navy. The legacy of Leyte remains the defining moment of American naval supremacy. The American fleet, utilizing its superior radar, air power, and the courage of its sailors and pilots, systematically dismantled the Japanese Navy, ensuring that the final campaigns of the Pacific War would be fought under conditions of total American control of the sea. The total destruction of the Japanese surface fleet was the non-negotiable strategic precondition for the final, total victory. The immense strategic victory at Leyte Gulf was fundamentally secured by a clear technological verdict: the overwhelming systemic superiority of the American defense in radar, fire control, and anti-aircraft weaponry. The technological chasm between the two forces amplified the effectiveness of the American fleet and sealed the fate of the Japanese aerial assaults. The core of the American technological advantage was advanced radar systems. The ability of the American fleet to detect incoming enemy formations, both conventional and kamikaze, at immense distances neutralized the element of surprise, the Japanese air arm's only viable tactical asset. Radar provided the critical early warning necessary for the American fleet to launch its own fighters, prepare the massive anti-aircraft barrage, and organize the coordinated defense. This technological foresight was a non-negotiable factor that guaranteed the success of the American defense. The second crucial element was superior anti-aircraft fire control. American ships were equipped with sophisticated automated targeting systems that allowed the massive anti-aircraft batteries to track and engage the incoming Japanese aircraft with devastating precision. The ubiquitous 40mm Bofors and 20mm Oerlikon cannons, coupled with their advanced aiming mechanisms, created a lethal, continuous cloud of flak that systematically disintegrated the Japanese planes before they could reach their targets. The immense, concentrated firepower was the ultimate execution of the technological verdict. The Japanese, conversely, were fighting with obsolete technology and a lack of adequate defenses. Their aircraft were often lightly armored and lacked the necessary speed and resilience to penetrate the dense American anti-aircraft defenses. Their radar and fire control systems were inferior, hindering their ability to coordinate their massive naval maneuvers and defend their own ships against the relentless American air attacks. The technological verdict was clear. The American system was structurally designed to absorb massive attacks and inflict devastating, disproportionate losses. The legacy of the technological verdict at Leyte remains a powerful testament to the strategic supremacy of industrial and scientific capacity. The American fleet, utilizing its superior technology and overwhelming industrial output, systematically defeated the Japanese air arm and surface fleet, ensuring that the final campaigns of the Pacific War would be fought under conditions of total American control. The technological advantage was the decisive strategic weapon that guaranteed the final total victory. The relentless, high-cost aerial engagements over Leyte Gulf marked the terminal phase of the final attrition that systematically consumed the operational capacity of the Japanese naval air arm. The immense, irreplaceable losses of aircraft and, crucially, trained pilots ensured that the Japanese Empire would never again possess the capacity to wage a sustained, organized air war. The ultimate defeat was a matter of terminal arithmetic, dictated by the relentless American material superiority. The consumption was total. The immense losses suffered by the Japanese in the Battle of the Philippine Sea, coupled with the continuous attrition of the Leyte engagements, rendered the Japanese Air Force a ghost of its former self. The Japanese capacity to replace the vast numbers of skilled pilots and specialized aircraft was functionally non-existent, forcing the command to resort to the desperate, high-cost strategy of the kamikaze attacks. The strategic air arm, the initial source of Japanese tactical success in the early war, was definitively broken over the Philippines. The attrition was amplified by the technological disparity. The technologically superior American defense, utilizing advanced radar and concentrated anti-aircraft fire, ensured that the Japanese losses were disproportionate and unsustainable. The Japanese pilots, flying lightly armored and often obsolete aircraft, were consumed by the overwhelming American defensive system, guaranteeing that their immense personal courage was strategically meaningless against the industrial power of the American war machine. The attrition was systematic, relentless, and unyielding. The final phase of attrition confirmed the ultimate strategic verdict. The war was won in the factories and the training schools. The American capacity to maintain a continuous flow of highly trained pilots and aircraft guaranteed that the immense losses sustained by the Japanese were quickly and continuously replaced. The Japanese High Command, conversely, was forced to expend its remaining irreplaceable assets in a futile defense, ensuring that the total consumption of their air arm was a matter of terminal arithmetic. The legacy of the final attrition remains a sobering testament to the immense, necessary cost of total war. The total consumption of the Japanese air arm was the final, non-negotiable strategic precondition for the final victory in the Pacific, guaranteeing that the final campaigns would be fought under conditions of total American air dominance. The immense human sacrifice of the Japanese pilots, fueled by desperation and a rigid code of honor, was ultimately consumed by the superior, industrialized resilience of the American system. The catastrophic strategic defeat suffered by the Japanese at Leyte Gulf inflicted profound, unseen costs that extended far beyond the loss of ships and aircraft. A total breakdown in morale, military discipline, and the capacity to envision a coherent strategic future. The Battle of Leyte was the moment the Japanese Imperial Army and Navy definitively realized the strategic futility of continued resistance against the overwhelming American war machine. The collapse of morale and discipline was immediate and pervasive. The immense losses suffered by the Japanese Navy and Air Force, coupled with the failure of Operation Shogo, shattered the remaining confidence of the Japanese command. The need to resort to the kamikaze attacks, a tragic admission of conventional military failure, further undermined the morale of the remaining pilots and sailors, who were forced to confront the terminal, irreversible nature of their strategic position. The high rates of attrition, the lack of air cover, and the continuous loss of ships created an environment of despair that fundamentally crippled the remaining Japanese defense. The total failure of the strategic plan meant that the Japanese command could no longer envision a coherent strategic future. The loss of the Philippines severed the vital sea lanes and exposed the Japanese home islands to direct attack, relegating the remaining Japanese garrisons to isolated, static defense against the inevitable American advance. The strategic objective shifted from winning the war to inflicting maximum casualties on the enemy, a desperate moral position that guaranteed the further consumption of their remaining, irreplaceable assets. The unseen costs of Leyte remain the most profound and lasting strategic consequence of the battle. The total collapse of the Japanese capacity to wage modern warfare, the breakdown in discipline, and the strategic paralysis that followed the loss of the fleet and the air arm guaranteed that the final campaigns of the Pacific War would be fought under conditions of total American strategic dominance. The Japanese were fighting a losing war of attrition that they could no longer sustain or morally justify. The legacy of Leyte is one of terminal strategic consumption. The battle was the final, definitive strategic act that sealed the fate of the Japanese Empire, confirming that the immense industrial and logistical power of the American system was the ultimate unassailable strategic weapon that guaranteed the final total victory. The Japanese pilots flew into a wall of flak and radar they never imagined, and the unseen costs of that final encounter broke the will of the Japanese Empire. The immense chaos of the Battle of Leyte Gulf was fundamentally rooted in the Japanese decoy strategy, a desperate high-stakes tactical maneuver designed to sacrifice their remaining aircraft carriers to secure a fleeting, decisive advantage for the surface fleet. This plan, orchestrated by Vice Admiral Jisaburo Ozawa, was the ultimate strategic gamble, a stark acknowledgement that the carriers, stripped of their air wings after previous defeats, were now functionally obsolete as fighting ships and were best utilized as disposable bait. Ozawa's mission was clear: lead his 4 carriers, the Zuikaku, Zuiho, Chitos, and Chiyoda, north of the Philippines, acting as a tempting, vulnerable target to lure away Admiral Halsey's powerful American Third Fleet. The success of the entire Operation Shogo hinged on this sacrifice. If Halsey took the bait and left the Leyte Gulf unguarded, the main Japanese surface fleet, Center Force, could sweep in and annihilate the vulnerable American invasion force. Ozawa executed his role with military precision, knowing that the loss of his command and the ships was inevitable. His objective was simply to draw the main fighting power of the enemy away from the crucial invasion site. Admiral Halsey, committed to the aggressive doctrine of annihilating the remaining Japanese carrier force, took the bait as planned, leading his fast carrier task force north in pursuit of Ozawa. While this decision was strategically sound in terms of destroying the Japanese naval air capability, effectively neutralizing the aircraft carriers forever, it left the 7th Fleet and the invasion fleet critically exposed to the advancing Japanese battleships. The immense gamble paid off for the Japanese decoy fleet. They achieved their primary objective, drawing away the massive defense shield. The cost of this strategic maneuver was total for Ozawa's fleet. The American carriers, catching up with the decoy fleet, systematically annihilated the remaining Japanese carriers and their minimal air cover. The loss confirmed the Japanese recognition that their naval air capacity was terminally consumed. However, the subsequent terrifying threat posed by the Center Force's advance toward the invasion fleet confirmed the high-stakes, dangerous success of the Japanese decoy strategy. The entire battle hinged on this single, audacious act of planned sacrifice, demonstrating that even a technologically and numerically inferior force could force the opponent into a difficult, high-stakes strategic choice. The legacy of Ozawa's final sacrifice is that of a complex, tragic military maneuver. The ships were lost, but the objective of the distraction was achieved, setting the stage for the chaotic, decisive battle off Samar that followed. The decoy was the pivot point that transformed the Battle of Leyte Gulf from a simple confrontation into a series of massive, complex engagements fought across the entire Philippine Sea. The greatest moment of individual heroism and tactical desperation in the entire Battle of Leyte Gulf occurred during the Battle off Samar, where the small, outmatched American task unit, Taffy 3, fought a near-suicidal engagement against the massive Japanese surface fleet. This battle was the direct consequence of the Japanese decoy strategy, forcing a handful of American escort carriers and destroyers to defend the entire invasion fleet against the primary Japanese striking force. Task Unit 77.43, Taffy 3, commanded by Rear Admiral Clifton Sprague, was composed of 6 small, lightly armored escort carriers, CVEs, and 7 destroyers and destroyer escorts. These ships were primarily tasked with anti-submarine patrols and close air support for the landing. They were fundamentally unprepared and outgunned for a direct engagement with Japanese battleships, including the massive Yamato. The shock of encountering the massive Japanese center force, led by Admiral Takeo Kurita, was immense and immediate. The defense executed by Taffy 3 was a demonstration of unyielding courage and audacious, high-risk tactics. The destroyers and escort carriers, operating under a dense, chaotic smokescreen laid by the destroyers, launched a continuous, coordinated series of attacks against the superior Japanese fleet. The destroyers committed themselves to seemingly suicidal torpedo runs, drawing the massive Japanese fire and confusing the command structure. The escort carriers, utilizing their small, minimal air wings, launched continuous air attacks with whatever ordnance they possessed, including anti-submarine torpedoes, further adding to the chaos and the Japanese sense of being under attack by a much larger force. The immense psychological and tactical effect of Taffy 3's defense was disproportionate to its size. The Japanese commander, Admiral Kurita, uncertain of the strength and identity of the defending force, and believing he was engaging the main American fleet, which should have been protecting the invasion, hesitated and became disorganized. This tactical confusion, coupled with the immense aggressive pressure from the small American destroyers, led Kurita to make the inexplicable decision to withdraw, abandoning the direct line of advance toward the vulnerable invasion fleet. The battle off Samar confirmed the immense, irreplaceable value of audacious, determined resistance in the face of overwhelming odds. The sacrifice of the ships and men of Taffy 3, fighting a delaying action that saved the entire invasion, remains one of the most heroic and decisive naval actions of the Pacific War. Their courage, fueled by the knowledge of the immense strategic value of the invasion they protected, was the essential human factor that guaranteed the total victory. Attention, Naval Command. You've witnessed the greatest stand of the Pacific War, the suicidal heroism of Taffy 3 against the Yamato. If the immense courage and strategic consequence of the Battle off Samar resonate with your analysis, do not let the record be obscured by the smoke. Subscribe now and commit to preserving the analysis of these pivotal human-driven victories. And here is your operational query. What was the single most decisive factor in Admiral Kurita's withdrawal? The perceived threat from American torpedoes, or the successful confusion caused by the small carrier's air attacks? Drop your strategic assessment in the comments below. Let the historical debate define naval strategy. The overwhelming strategic success of the American defense in the air and naval engagements at Leyte Gulf was fundamentally secured by the decisive technological differential between the American and Japanese fleets. The systematic superiority of American radar, fire control, and anti-aircraft weaponry ensured that the Japanese forces, already suffering from numerical and material disadvantages, were systematically consumed by the technologically advanced American defensive system. The core of the American technological advantage was the superiority of radar technology. American ships were equipped with advanced long-range radar systems that provided critical early warning of incoming Japanese formations, air and naval alike, neutralizing the element of surprise and providing crucial time for the fleet to organize its defense. This technological foresight was a non-negotiable factor that allowed the American defense to engage the enemy on favorable terms, a capability the Japanese system critically lacked. The immense scale of the American anti-aircraft fire control was equally devastating. Ships were bristling with automated high-rate-of-fire anti-aircraft guns, including the ubiquitous Bofors and Oerlikon cannons, guided by sophisticated integrated aiming mechanisms. This system created a lethal, continuous cloud of flak that systematically destroyed the incoming Japanese aircraft before they could reach their targets. The immense, concentrated firepower was the ultimate execution of the technological verdict, a destructive force that the obsolete Japanese aircraft and surface ships could neither evade nor overcome. The Japanese, conversely, were fighting with obsolete and inconsistent technology. Their surface fleet lacked adequate radar and fire control systems, hindering their ability to coordinate their massive naval maneuvers and defend their own ships against the relentless American air attacks. Their aircraft were often lightly armored and lacked the necessary speed and resilience to penetrate the dense American anti-aircraft defense. The technological disparity amplified the effects of the numerical and material disadvantages, ensuring that the Japanese losses were disproportionate and terminal. The legacy of the technological differential at Leyte remains a powerful testament to the strategic supremacy of industrial and scientific capacity. The American fleet, utilizing its superior technology and overwhelming industrial output, systematically dismantled the Japanese Navy and Air Arm, ensuring that the final campaigns of the Pacific War would be fought under conditions of total American control of the sea and air. The technological advantage was the decisive strategic weapon that guaranteed the final, total victory. The immense strategic importance of the Battle of Leyte Gulf was tragically marked by the formal introduction of the kamikaze suicide attack units, a catastrophic strategic paradox that exposed the moral and operational collapse of the Japanese Empire. The kamikaze, intended as a final decisive weapon of terror, was simultaneously an admission of total conventional military failure and a profound ethical transgression. The paradox of the kamikaze was rooted in the strategic failure of conventional air power. The Japanese command, realizing that their remaining aircraft could not penetrate the sophisticated American defenses and achieve decisive results, resorted to the high-cost strategy of prioritizing the destruction of enemy materiel over the life of the pilot. The suicide attacks were a desperate attempt to compensate for the overwhelming American technological and material superiority, a tactical gamble that exposed the fatal obsolescence of the Japanese air arm. The ethical dimension of the kamikaze was profound. The systematic prioritization of self-destruction and the explicit disregard for the sanctity of human life were a total moral failure of the collapsing regime. The immense tragic sacrifice of the Japanese pilots, fueled by desperation and a rigid code of honor, was strategically meaningless in the long term. While the kamikaze attacks inflicted immense psychological shock and localized severe damage on the American fleet, the strategic consequences were negligible. The American capacity to sustain losses and repair damage was unassailable. The strategic consequence of the kamikaze paradox was the total consumption of irreplaceable human resources. The Japanese capacity to replace the vast numbers of skilled pilots consumed by the suicide attacks was non-existent, ensuring that the remaining Japanese air arm was manned by inexperienced, rapidly trained crews. The strategic decision to utilize the kamikaze weapon was a terminal consumption of the final irreplaceable assets of the Japanese Air Force. The legacy of the kamikaze remains a tragic testament to the moral bankruptcy and operational collapse of the Japanese Empire. The suicide attacks, while initially shocking, were systematically neutralized by the technological and logistical superiority of the American defense. The immense human cost of the kamikaze paradox was immense, guaranteeing the total consumption of the Japanese Air Force and cementing the strategic verdict that the total collapse of the Japanese Empire was irreversible. The overwhelming strategic victory at Leyte Gulf, secured by the massive deployment of ships, aircraft, and manpower, carried a final, crucial, unseen logistical tally. The immense, sustained flow of fuel, ammunition, and replacement parts required to sustain the complex, month-long engagement. This logistical tally confirms the ultimate decisive role of industrial capacity in the massive final engagements of the Pacific War. The total fuel consumption of the massive American 3rd and 7th Fleets, operating continuously across the vast distances of the Philippine Sea, was astronomical. The success of the operation was entirely dependent on the continuous, efficient refueling and resupply of the carriers, destroyers, and battleships. The immense logistical depth of the American supply system, utilizing massive fleet oilers and specialized transport vessels, guaranteed that the fleet maintained its operational capacity and dominance over the Japanese Navy, which critically lacked adequate logistical support. The immense ammunition expenditure during the air and naval engagements was equally crucial. The vast anti-aircraft barrages, the relentless air attacks by the carrier aircraft, and the massive naval gun duels consumed millions of rounds of ammunition and thousands of aerial ordnance. The American logistical machine was structurally designed to sustain this immense, high-intensity consumption, ensuring that the fleet maintained its continuous, devastating firepower against the Japanese attacks. The Japanese forces, conversely, were fighting with diminishing reserves and a critically compromised logistical chain. The strategic success of Leyte was ultimately dictated by the unseen logistical tally. The ability of the American system to sustain the immense material consumption of the battle, replace losses rapidly, and maintain the operational capacity of the fleet was the final, non-negotiable strategic advantage. The Japanese forces, lacking the industrial and logistical depth, were consumed by the immense material consumption of the battle, ensuring that their immense sacrifice was strategically meaningless. The legacy of Leyte is a testament to the strategic supremacy of industrial resilience. The battle confirmed that the decisive factor in modern warfare is not just tactical skill, but the organizational capacity to mobilize and sustain immense material consumption. The immense logistical tally was the ultimate, unassailable evidence that the total collapse of the Japanese Empire was irreversible. The brutal, high-cost nature of the aerial and naval engagements at Leyte Gulf served as a grim strategic foreshadowing of the final desperate battles that awaited the American forces in the final assaults on the Japanese Empire. Iwo Jima and Okinawa. The immense strategic risk and the fanatical, high-cost resistance encountered at Leyte provided critical, terrifying lessons for the American command regarding the necessary scale of force and the expected casualty rates for the final campaigns. The foreshadowing was rooted in the Japanese commitment to total attrition and no surrender. The immense ferocity of the Japanese defense, the systematic use of the kamikaze suicide attacks, and the desperate commitment of the final naval and air reserves all confirmed that the final battles for the Japanese homeland would be fought to the point of maximum, unnecessary human cost. The strategic planning for Iwo Jima and Okinawa was immediately adjusted to account for the systematic annihilation of the enemy garrison, necessitating the commitment of overwhelming naval, air, and ground forces. The foreshadowing also concerned the Japanese technological and tactical response. The Japanese reliance on concentrated anti-aircraft fire, systematic destruction of airfields and infrastructure, and the final desperate commitment to new specialized tactics, such as the extensive use of heavily fortified cave networks and hidden pillboxes, all indicated that the American forces would face a highly skilled, determined adversary fighting on home ground. The lessons learned in Leyte, the necessity of overwhelming anti-aircraft defense and rapid airfield repair, were immediately applied to the planning for the final island assaults. The strategic consequence of the foreshadowing was the commitment of immense, unprecedented resources. The American command understood that the final battles would be wars of extermination, requiring the full mobilization of the American industrial and human reserves. The immense scale of the invasion forces committed to Iwo Jima and Okinawa, and the systematic use of overwhelming firepower, were direct consequences of the grim lessons learned in the Philippine Sea. The strategic foresight gained at Leyte was the necessary brutal precondition for the final total victory. The legacy of Leyte, therefore, is one of strategic preparation and grim anticipation. The immense battles fought in the Philippine Sea confirmed the total strategic commitment required to defeat the Japanese Empire and provided the necessary strategic framework for the final, costly assaults on the home islands. The foreshadowing was accurate, and the final battles proved to be the most costly and brutal of the entire Pacific War. The colossal, high-cost Battle of Leyte Gulf delivered a profound human factor cost, the immense, irreplaceable loss of trained pilots and sailors that underscored the total sacrifice demanded by the engagement. The strategic victory was secured by the American system, but the price was paid by the individual courage and ultimate sacrifice of the combatants on both sides. The human cost for the Japanese Empire was terminal. The systematic destruction of their naval air arm, coupled with the immense consumption of pilots in the kamikaze attacks, ensured that the vast majority of their remaining skilled air personnel were consumed by the battle. The immense personal courage and fanaticism of the Japanese pilots, flying obsolete aircraft into overwhelming defenses, were tragically nullified by the technological and numerical superiority of the American system. The loss was total and strategically irreversible. The human cost for the American forces was immense, but sustainable. The heroic defense of Taffy 3, the continuous air attacks by the carrier pilots, and the sustained anti-aircraft fire required immense individual courage and discipline. While the American losses were significant, the superior American logistical and training system guaranteed that the immense sacrifice was quickly and systematically replaced. The resilience and professionalism of the American sailor and pilot were the essential human factors that guaranteed the final victory. The psychological dimension of the human cost was profound. The American forces, confronting the terrifying reality of the kamikaze attacks and the brutal intensity of the naval engagements, were tested to their limits. The immense strategic risk and the high casualty rates placed immense stress on the entire American command and fighting force. The memory of Leyte remains a testament to the immense, sustained pressure of modern naval warfare. The legacy of the human factor in Leyte remains a sobering reminder of the ultimate cost of total war. The strategic victory was secured by the system, but the price was paid by the immense individual courage and sacrifice of the combatants. The immense human cost cemented the ultimate strategic verdict. The war was won by the system that could sustain the greatest losses and continue the relentless application of overwhelming force. The immense scale and high-intensity nature of the Battle of Leyte Gulf confirmed the immense vastness of Pacific logistics, the non-negotiable strategic imperative of sustaining a massive naval and air force across the immense distances of the Pacific Ocean. The total strategic success of the American operation was fundamentally secured by the unparalleled logistical depth of the American supply system. The logistical challenge was rooted in the immense geographical scale. The American fleet was operating thousands of miles from its nearest major base, requiring a continuous, massive flow of fuel, ammunition, and replacement parts to sustain the high operational tempo. The American logistical system, utilizing massive fleet oilers, specialized transport vessels, and immense floating supply depots, guaranteed that the fleet maintained its operational capacity and dominance over the vast Philippine Sea. The Japanese Navy, conversely, was fighting with diminishing reserves and a critically compromised logistical chain. The complexity of the logistical supply was immense. The American system had to continuously resupply the massive number of carrier aircraft, the intricate anti-aircraft batteries, and the immense naval guns, ensuring that the fleet maintained its continuous, devastating firepower against the Japanese attacks. The total consumption of fuel and ordnance during the Leyte engagements was astronomical, requiring the systematic deployment of the American industrial capacity to sustain the high-intensity battle. The The strategic consequences of this vast logistical capacity were total. The American fleet, fueled by the immense industrial output of the American homeland, could sustain the high-intensity engagement indefinitely, ensuring that the Japanese Navy and Air Arm were consumed by a terminal war of attrition. The Japanese forces, lacking the logistical depth, were forced into high-risk, desperate maneuvers that guaranteed the total consumption of their remaining assets. The logistical vastness was the ultimate strategic advantage that guaranteed the final, total victory. The legacy of Pacific logistics remains a testament to the strategic supremacy of industrial mobilization. The Battle of Leyte confirmed that the total conquest of the Pacific was fundamentally dependent on the organizational capacity to sustain a massive, technologically advanced force across immense distances. The logistical vastness was the final, unassailable strategic weapon that guaranteed the total collapse of the Japanese Empire. The colossal strategic engagement at Leyte Gulf delivered a profound strategic finality, the irreversible verdict that the Japanese capacity to wage modern, sustained warfare was permanently consumed. The total strategic and material losses suffered by the Japanese Navy and Air Arm ensured that the final campaigns of the Pacific War would be fought under conditions of total American material and operational dominance. The finality was rooted in the total consumption of naval and air power. The immense losses of carriers, battleships, and, crucially, trained pilots and aircraft meant that the Japanese Empire was permanently stripped of its capacity to challenge American control of the sea and the air. The final campaigns would be fought against a geographically vast but strategically isolated enemy, guaranteeing that the American advance toward the home islands would be relentless and unyielding. The strategic perimeter was irrevocably broken. The finality was amplified by the total failure of Operation Shogo. The Japanese strategic gamble, predicated on the desperate hope of annihilating the American invasion fleet, resulted only in the total consumption of their remaining assets. The immense strategic cost of the battle was total, ensuring that the Japanese Empire could no longer envision a coherent strategic future. The remaining Japanese forces were relegated to isolated, static defense, awaiting the inevitable final assault. The legacy of Leyte is one of strategic consumption and total defeat. The battle confirmed that the ultimate determinant of victory in modern warfare is the capacity to sustain the immense material consumption of high-intensity engagements. The total destruction of the Japanese Navy and Air Arm was the final, non-negotiable strategic precondition for the final victory in the Pacific, guaranteeing that the path to the final defeat of the Japanese Empire was now clear and irreversible. The strategic finality delivered at Leyte remains a sobering testament to the immense, decisive role of logistics and industrial capacity in modern warfare. The battle confirmed the ultimate strategic truth. The immense material and operational superiority of the American system was the final, unassailable weapon that guaranteed the total victory. The brutal, high-cost strategic victory at Leyte Gulf left an enduring strategic legacy that fundamentally reshaped military doctrine, confirming the decisive role of integrated technology, logistics, and command in large-scale naval warfare. The colossal engagement provided a final, clear articulation of the strategic realities that dictated the total defeat of the Japanese Empire. The core legacy is the primacy of integrated naval air power. The battle confirmed that the aircraft carrier, supported by massive logistical depth, was the ultimate capital ship of the modern era. The systematic destruction of the Japanese naval air arm, coupled with the immense operational superiority of the American carrier fleet, cemented the future dominance of carrier-based warfare. The immense logistical effort required to sustain the carrier fleet across the vast Pacific confirmed the non-negotiable link between logistics and operational power. The second legacy is the absolute necessity of technological superiority in defense. The American deployment of advanced radar and sophisticated anti-aircraft fire control systems demonstrated that technology is the ultimate force multiplier in naval defense. The technological verdict delivered at Leyte confirmed that future naval engagements would be defined by the capacity to deploy and sustain advanced integrated defensive systems that could counter the immense threat of air power. The third legacy is the final confirmation of industrial mobilization as the ultimate weapon. The immense material consumption of the battle and the total irreversible losses suffered by the Japanese forces confirmed that total war is ultimately won by the side that can mobilize and sustain the largest and most efficient industrial base. The American logistical depth, fueled by industrial output, was the decisive strategic weapon that guaranteed the total victory. The final legacy of Leyte remains a testament to the immense strategic cost and the ultimate strategic clarity of the Pacific War. The battle was the decisive final act that sealed the fate of the Japanese Empire, confirming that the total victory was secured by the superior system, the unwavering command, and the immense industrial power of the American forces. The immense strategic victory ensured that the final campaigns of the Pacific War would be fought under conditions of total American strategic and operational dominance.